Thank you very much. Well, okay, so I gave this talk at a TEDx conference in London.
Fuck that!
Which was specifically supposed to be examining new paradigms. So I didn't expect any problems whatsoever in that situation. And it came as a surprise to me when my talk and also the talk by Rupert Sheldrake were deleted from the TEDx YouTube channel. And it turned out that the decision to delete our two talks was given in a little notice by TED, where they said that both Rupert and I had been practicing pseudoscience, and that this was why the talks had to be deleted. They then gave an entirely fictional account of the content of my talk. Not a single thing that they said about the content of my talk I had actually said in the talk, which is an incredibly stupid thing to do of them in writing, since all they had to do was listen to what at that point was an 18-minute talk, you know. The same with Rupert. So we challenged them on this, and there was tremendous support from the global community brought together by that wonderful vehicle of freedom of speech called the internet, and of the sharing of ideas, which challenged TED on this. First of all, this incredibly paternalistic action, as though we are not adults who can make up our own minds about the content of talks. The TED view was that the public had to be protected from our talks. And secondly, because their reasons for deleting the talks turned out to be entirely bogus. Suddenly they realized that they were in danger of perhaps even a defamation action, and they got worried, and what they then did was they kept their objections up on their website, but they crossed them all out. And then they allowed Rupert and I to publish our rebuttals on the same website, on what Rupert calls the naughty corner of the TED website, where what they would not do is allow our talks to be put back on the YouTube channel, and that will apparently never happen. So I was trying to understand why they objected to our talks and to my talk, The War on Consciousness. One of the things they said in their later, the initial bogus reasons were all crossed out, but then they said TED could not endorse this talk because it might encourage some young person to go to the Amazon and drink ayahuasca. This, of course, also is a very lunatic thing to say, but what it really boiled down to was that what my talk and Rupert Sheldrake's talk had in common was that they considered the possibility of a non-local basis to consciousness. That consciousness may not be an epiphenomenon of brain activity, that it may be more mysterious than that. And this, it seems, runs up against a fundamental dogma of materialist science, which is that everything may be reduced to its material substrate, and that there is nothing outside that, let alone any possibility of a spirit world. So I'm going to give the talk that I gave, but I'm going to elaborate on it and intervene in it at certain points and give it in a perhaps more fluid way than I did with TED. What first attracted me to psychedelics, apart from just one extraordinary LSD experience at the Windsor Free Festival in 1974. Apart from that, what attracted me I didn't take psychedelics again for many, many, many years. What I did do was I started smoking cannabis in 1987, and I'll come to that, but of course cannabis is not a psychedelic, although I must say when I first started to smoke it, I felt it was quite psychedelic. What attracted me to exploring and working with psychedelics myself was the fact that I was writing a book about a mysterious in the evolution of human behavior when our ancestors' behavior suddenly takes a huge step forward. And this moment occurs really quite recently, pretty much within the last 100,000 years, and most dramatically within the last 40,000 years. And the little diagram of the evolutionary tree up on the screen, this is what I call 6 million years of boredom. Because for most of the 6 million years between the last common ancestor with the chimpanzee and us, our ancestors were really very dull. The first stone tools were introduced 2.5 million years ago. Once they'd been put into place, the exact same tool set continued to be used without any changes for more than 1 million years. And what this tells us is that cultural information is being passed down by our species, but that it is being interpreted in an incredibly rigid and narrow way, with no changes, no innovation, no lateral thinking evident at all. When another tool type is introduced, it also sticks for about 1 million years without any changes. And this continues down past the time when our ancestors became anatomically modern, which is about 195,000 years ago, according to the latest skeletal evidence. Our ancestors continue to behave in a dull and rigid and narrow way. Now, one of the first to realize that psychedelics may have played a huge role in making us what we are today was, of course, the late, great Terence Mckenna with his wonderful stoned ape theory. And I think it's just yet another area in which Terence was incredibly prescient in his understanding of the mysteries of the human condition. But I think it's important to recognize also a number of academics like David Lewis Williams, who was working on the problem of cave art from the 1970s, as a matter of fact, at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. So here is the thing. There's some first signs of symbolic activity amongst our ancestors somewhere around 100, 125,000 years ago. It's pretty limited. They start wearing shell beads, for example, and that is a symbolic act. But it's really only when you get down to about 40,000 years ago or less that you get this explosion of remarkable art in the painted caves of southern Europe and all around the world, in Australia as well. And in southern Africa. And this art, although created by cultures that certainly were not in contact with one another geographically, and that were often separated by thousands of years in time, this art has very distinctive characteristics. Very distinctive patterns appear, and very distinctive entities appear, of which the most, the really signal entity is the therianthrope, the creature that is part animal and part human in form. And after 100 years of fruitless and sterile discussion about what cave art was about, it was really David Lewis Williams and a few of his colleagues in the late 70s through into the 80s who began to home in on the heart of the matter, which is that the fundamental shared universal characteristics of rock and cave art can be best explained if we understand that the artists were shamans, and that those artists were doing what shamans always do and continue to do today, which is experiencing deeply altered states of consciousness. And in those trance states, having visionary experiences and entity encounters, which were then depicted on the walls of the caves and the rock shelters after they had returned to a daily alert problem-solving state of consciousness. And what's interesting about it is that just at the moment that we get this explosion of cave art around the world, it's as though a light has been turned on in the human brain everywhere. And our ancestors become, remember, they're already anatomically modern, but their behavior becomes very different. And notably, we start finding evidence for spiritual beliefs, the burial of grave goods, of food, of water with the dead. Indeed, the burial of the dead begins for the first time. And very innovative hunting strategies. These creatures have undergone some kind of experiences which has transformed them. And there's a correlation with the cave art. It would be going too far to say that the that the experiences that led to the cave art actually caused all of these other changes in human behavior as well, but personally, I think that's what happened. And it's clear from the nature of the art itself that our ancestors had encountered psychedelic fungi and plants and had undergone extraordinary experiences which had led them to produce this art. So that meant, if I wanted to research this subject, that I needed again to take psychedelics, as I had last done in 1974. And that's why I first went down to the Amazon in 2003 to drink ayahuasca, which Jeremy was talking about a few moments ago. And I went there because I learned that the shamans of the Amazon, after their ayahuasca sessions, would very frequently paint their visions, and that there were distinct common factors between their paintings and the paintings on the walls of the painted caves 30 or 40,000 years ago. So here was an opportunity to get inside the experience rather than simply stand back remotely and write about it in an academic way. I could have the experience myself. And I went down to the Amazon and began what was the first of many encounters with ayahuasca. I didn't expect that. The first 11 sessions that I had with ayahuasca in the Amazon, I thought that would be the end of it for me. But I found the experience so challenging and so life-changing in so many ways that I decided to continue with ayahuasca. And I try to have 5 sessions of ayahuasca every year, if possible. Now, I think everybody in the room knows the mysterious chemistry of ayahuasca, that its active ingredient is DMT, dimethyltryptamine, but that DMT is not normally orally accessible, that there's an enzyme, monoamine oxidase, in our gut, which switches off DMT on contact. And the way they've got round this in the Amazon, the DMT is contained in the leaves of this bush, which is Psychotria viridis. And DMT is closely related molecularly to psilocybin, by the way. And the way they get round it in the Amazon is with the ayahuasca vine. And the ayahuasca vine contains a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. So it then becomes possible, when you cook together the leaves and the vine, to switch off the monoamine oxidase in the gut and produce an orally active brew. And that is the ayahuasca vine. And in the Amazon, they say that's where the intelligence in the brew lies, that the vine has somehow harnessed the force of the DMT in order to gain access to the human mind. And those of us who have drunk ayahuasca will be familiar with the slight churning of the gut that this bottle of the brew produces. It is quite an obnoxious taste. Actually, arguably one of the most obnoxious tastes on the planet. I've had about 50 sessions of ayahuasca now. I don't vomit as much these days as I used to. I still do, but not so much. But it's a formidable thing, and as it passes your lips, you realize that you're dealing with something serious, something that is to be taken seriously. Typically, within 45 minutes or so, you might start to sweat. You might start to feel a little bit dizzy, and your stomach is going. And that, for Westerners, is quite a difficult thing. I mean, this is one of the reasons. But those who are afraid of some sort of ayahuasca danger, keep saying that. But isn't it addictive? And I mean, the answer is that you have to brace yourself every time for an ayahuasca session. It's not something that you just rush into, feeling completely like you're going to go and have a recreational time. It's a very challenging physical experience, and it's a very challenging emotional experience as well. That being said, I just tell this little joke about my friend Luis Eduardo Luna, who's been drinking ayahuasca for 40 years, and he was asked that question by somebody: "Isn't it addictive?" And Luis said, "No, it's not addictive. I know. I've drunk it more than 1,000 times." but definitely not addictive. One of the things it teaches you is that the body is the least important part of ourselves. You know, the shitting, the vomiting, all of that, it's a little bit uncomfortable. In a way, it's very cleansing, and pretty soon you get over it, and you don't worry too much about that. And what is interesting is what is happening at the level of consciousness. And Pablo Amaringo's images of his ayahuasca visions are a kind of a good introduction to the enchanted, richly color-saturated realm of ayahuasca, and the sense that everything that you encounter there is filled with intelligence and intent. And it's a curious phenomenon that as ayahuasca has made its way out into the Western world and into the industrialized and technological societies, that people who drink ayahuasca all over the world, whether they go to Peru as ayahuasca tourists or to Brazil, or whether they encounter ayahuasca in London or Tokyo or New York, are reporting meeting an intelligent entity. And that intelligent entity is very frequently described as Mother Ayahuasca, or sometimes the grandmother, or the mother. This is a very curious thing. Not all Amazonian tribes experience the spirit of ayahuasca as feminine. There are some tribes in the Amazon who experience the spirit of ayahuasca as male. But in the West, we seem to be experiencing her as a woman, or as a female serpent very often, or as a jaguar. And this is a curious universal transpersonal thing which is going on. And this is one of the reasons why I got into trouble with TED. I made very clear that I claim no reality status for Mother Ayahuasca. I cannot prove that Mother Ayahuasca exists or is real in any objective sense. I cannot prove that this entity is not a projection of my own mind and of other people's minds. But all I can say is that at a personal level, in the encounters that I have had with this entity, she seems pretty real to me. And I experience her as a kind of goddess who is a tough teacher and who wants me to be the best that I can possibly be, and will give me a hard time if I am not. This is the experience that I have with the ayahuasca brew. A healer and a creative guide. I mean, this is the work of Martina Hoffman, who is an artist working out of Boulder, Colorado. Her partner, the late Robert Venosa, was another artist whose work has been enormously influenced by ayahuasca, and I think everybody's familiar with the work of Alex Gray as well. There's no doubt that there's a phenomenon of ayahuasca art, that a huge boost of creativity has been given to artists who've worked with ayahuasca. And then there's the healing aspect of ayahuasca. I tell you an absolutely extraordinary story. A young man, this is completely true, a young man who I drank ayahuasca with in January had during the session, he emerged from the session in tears, and he had encountered Mother Ayahuasca, and she had told him that there was a problem with his testicles. She had told him that he might not be able to father a child. And he was so filled with grief, and then she said to him, but I'll work with you and try to make this better. And I'm sorry, this is a kind of intimate thing to say, but he was guided to put his hand down and to hold his testicles. After he came back to England, he went and had a test done, and it was found that he has a very high level of abnormal sperm. To me, I mean, this is a very difficult thing to explain, how in a vision one can gain a biological truth about oneself, so much so that he's now in a program for in vitro fertilization with his wife. A healer, a moral teacher, a creative guide. This is why I think that ayahuasca is so successful in getting people off addictions to hard drugs, something that our society is dismally failing at doing. particularly with heroin and cocaine. And there are a couple of places. There's the work of Dr. Jacques Mabit at the Taquihuasi Clinic in Tarapoto in Peru, where they bring heroin and cocaine addicts for several weeks, give them about a dozen ayahuasca sessions. A great many of them leave completely free of addiction. And there's also the work of Dr. Gabor Mate in Canada. And again, he was very successful giving ayahuasca as a therapy for drug addiction until the Canadian government stepped in and stopped him on the grounds that ayahuasca was itself a drug. Now, this is where I have to bare my own heart and explain and speak about my own addiction, which was to cannabis. But I think it's a moot point whether cannabis is an addictive drug or not. But when you get to the stage where you smoke cannabis from the moment that you wake up in the morning until 2 o'clock the next morning, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, which is what I was doing, then I'm not sure whether any other word except addiction really applies. I was certainly abusing cannabis. There's no doubt about that. And I want to make absolutely clear in what I have to say about cannabis that I do not blame the herb itself. I think cannabis is a wonderful sensual and spiritual ally. I don't think that I would ever have written my books on historical mysteries if I hadn't encountered cannabis, weirdly, almost for the first time, in 1987 when I was 37 years old. I think it helped me to shift my creativity in a different direction. But as the years went by, I went on from smoking cannabis on evenings and weekends. It was when I started to write Fingerprints of the Gods that I said to myself, why don't I see if I can write stoned? And I found I could. And in fact, the very fact that I was writing gave me an excellent excuse to be stoned all day long, which was what I wanted to be. And the fact that I could continue writing and it seemed to be helping me with my creativity was very important. So I can say that for most of 24 years, through until October 2011, I was pretty much stoned all the time. And I thought, enjoyed it. But in the latter years, there were undoubted negative impacts on my behavior towards others. And again, I want to be clear, I do not blame the herb for that. I blame my own self-indulgent, abusive relationship with the herb. And I wish that I had not allowed the relationship to go that way, but I did. And what happened, and this became particularly pronounced during the decade after the year 2000, was that I became more and more suspicious, jealous, and paranoid. I related to everyone and everything from a place of suspicion and fear. I began to have elaborate, jealous fantasies about my wonderful wife and partner, Santa, and I began to give her a really, really, really hard time because I was convincing myself that those fantasies were true, when there was absolutely nothing to them whatsoever. And right from the beginning, when I began to drink ayahuasca in 2003, I started to get messages from ayahuasca that I needed to do something about my cannabis habit, which I completely ignored those messages because I felt that cannabis was fundamental to my happiness and to my writing. I felt I couldn't write without it, and I used to organize my life around cannabis. So when we would go on a journey, I would have key people in different cities who would meet me and give me a little bit of cannabis so that I could have cannabis wherever I went. And if I couldn't get it, I would seriously not want to go to the country where I couldn't get it. It was a very, very central part of my life. And this continued until October 2011, when a couple of things happened to me in very short order. The first was a DMT trip that I had in Utah in the United States. Now, I first smoked DMT again, as part of my research, when I was researching Supernatural, and I described the first 2 trips in Supernatural, and they were rather scary and confusing. But then the next 8 trips that I had with DMT, I always had them at this particular retreat in Utah, and they were always beautiful. I had beautiful trips. I had a sense of my body being scanned. I had a sense of healing, a sense of communion and connection. These were very positive trips. So when I went down to Utah in late September 2011 and had a DMT session planned, I expected only good things from it. Instead, basically, of course, I'm sure many people in this room have already experienced DMT, but there is no real negotiation with smoked DMT. With ayahuasca, there is negotiation. The ayahuasca journey lasts about 4 hours. Smoked DMT lasts typically for 15 minutes or less. But when you're in the journey, there's very little that you can do about it. And after the 4th deep inhalation from the pipe, I fell back on the bed and was immediately drawn, contrary to my expectations, into an utterly terrifying realm. And I just was on Google Images this morning and picking up some of this is actually a Shipibo weaving based on ayahuasca experiences from the Amazon. It started off seeing something like this, except it was in motion, and it was filled with a kind of menacing intent, and it was poised just over me. And then I heard a voice which said, "You're ours now." And I thought, that was my last thought, was, fuck me, but only for 12 minutes. And then I was in this place. Now, I don't believe in hell, but there was something a little hellish about it, like this Hieronymus Bosch painting. It was I felt that I was lying on some sort of table and my body was being ripped apart, just like I was a cocoon, and pieces were being torn off my body. And then I heard a sort of trumpet blast. And another voice said, "Now the great transformation shall begin," or it could have been, "Now the great unfolding will begin." And instead of these little demons, I was seeing these kind of things, these kind of entities which were all over me and tearing me and ripping me apart. And then I completely lost any consciousness or connection of what happened. And when I emerged back into the room where I'd smoked the DMT, for the first few moments I had no idea where I was. And it shook me to the core, this experience. And I felt in some way that I was being weighed up and found wanting in my life. And I was therefore very concerned that I was about to get on a plane and fly from Utah to Brazil and have 5 ayahuasca sessions, where I wouldn't be theirs for 12 minutes, but I would be for up to 4 hours at a time. And that's what happened. I went down to Brazil, and I had the 5 most shattering ayahuasca sessions that I have ever had in my life. And they all focused on failures in my behavior towards others and the pain that I was causing to my partner, Santha. I was given a complete life review. I was shown episodes from my life in an utterly unsympathetic mode, and made to feel very much as though, sorry, I just have to not have my power cable cut in half, made to feel very much as though I were in jeopardy in some way. And what I liken it to is what the ancient Egyptians called the Hall of Ma'at, or the Judgment Hall of Osiris, where your soul, represented by this little vase here, which actually represents the heart of the deceased, the soul of the deceased, is weighed in the scales against the feather of truth and justice and cosmic harmony. And the message I got very, very clearly was that if I were to die and were to go beyond death, I would find myself in a place where I could not account properly for my life. that I was making serious mistakes, and that they had to be put right, and that in some way this was connected to cannabis. And the upshot was that I decided I would alter my relationship with cannabis, and that when I came back to England, I would go back to my old pattern of smoking it only on evenings and weekends, and I would get into some kind of respectful relationship with it rather than the relationship that I had. But this matter was taken out of my hands, because when I got back to England and fired up my vaporizer and had the first couple of puffs, I found that I actually could not smoke cannabis again. I simply could not do it. I was filled with such feelings of horror and revulsion, such a revisiting of that hell realm that I had been taken into, that I just could not continue with it. And I stopped and parted company with 6 ounces of very good skunk and 3 vaporizers, because I was afraid that the government would ban peripherals, so I had 3 vaporizers. Gave it all away and haven't actually smoked or vaporized cannabis ever again since then. I'm coming up to now 2 years without smoking cannabis. And my fear that I wouldn't be able to write without cannabis has proved completely unfounded. On the contrary, I'm writing much more fluently and productive than I did then. So in some way, this experience was connected with the mystery of death. And we ask ourselves, what is death? And there is this widely used legal definition, which is typical of materialist science, that death is the complete cessation of brain function as evidenced by the absence of brainwave activity on the electroencephalogram. To which I would say, we are not necessarily our brains. We are our consciousness. And what consciousness is kind of a moot point. It's a mystery. Definitely the brain is involved in consciousness in some way. There's just really no serious disputing that. And most materialist scientists will say, well, look, if I damage this particular area of your brain, or if this particular area of your brain is accidentally damaged, it will affect your consciousness, and therefore that proves that your consciousness is an artifact of your brain. In fact, they call consciousness an epiphenomenon of brain activity, that through the struggle of evolution, the human species has evolved this very smart, complicated brain in order that we might survive. And as an accidental byproduct of those survival functions, we've got this thing called consciousness, which we experience in unquantifiable ways, like the feeling of love or our reaction to a beautiful sunset or to a symphony. And there's a default mode in science, which is that the brain makes consciousness the way a generator makes electricity. That's why a man like Richard Dawkins, who is a brilliant man, I have to confess, cannot possibly believe in life after death. If your reference frame is that the brain makes consciousness, then obviously when the brain is dead, that's the end of your consciousness. You're just meat, you rot away, you're gone, there is no life after death, there is nothing whatsoever. And that is the natural outcome of the reference frame, that the brain makes consciousness. But actually, this is a reference frame, not a fact. There is no underpinning evidence that the brain makes consciousness, and it's at least equally possible that the relationship of consciousness to the brain is more like the relationship of the TV signal to the TV set, that the brain is a junction box connecting consciousness to the material realm, a transceiver of consciousness, if you like, and that once you hold this point of view, then of course it is possible to believe in life after death. You've simply incarnated temporarily in a human body. And when that body dies, you go back into the realm of spirit and can re-enter perhaps in another human body in some years to come. And I must say that this particular view of consciousness helps to explain a lot of anomalies. This is the non-local view of consciousness. It helps to explain the compelling evidence for reincarnation that Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia produced in his studies, or for near-death or out-of-body experiences. At any rate, if we want to consider the mystery of life after death, we would not get very fruitful answers from any materialist scientist, because they've already got it sorted out. There is no life after death, and there cannot possibly be. If we want to inquire into this mystery, much better to go and talk to people like the ancient Egyptians, who put their best minds to work for 3,000 years on the problem of life after death, and came to some very definite and specific conclusions that the soul makes a journey after death, that we have had a precious opportunity to be born in a human body, and that we need to account for everything, every moment, every thought, every deed, every action, every second of our lives, and that we should view our lives as a work of art. We might make mistakes, we might have problems along the way, but we have enough time in this lifespan to perfect that work of art. And the objective of the whole exercise at the end of it is to be able to look back on it all and say, well, fundamentally, I did good. I lived in harmony with the universe. This was the ancient Egyptian idea, and the idea of the duat, the afterlife realm, through which we travel after death, is very thoroughly described in their religious texts. And it's now clear that the ancient Egyptians did deliberately cultivate altered states of consciousness, and did use visionary plants, such as the blue water lily. And interestingly, my friend Terence Mckenna has recently, who is an ethnopharmacologist, has recently identified the ancient Egyptian tree of life, upon which the god Thoth writes your name when you become immortal, has identified the ancient Egyptian tree of life as Acacia nilotica. And Acacia nilotica is a species that is rich in DMT. So we have to consider the possibility that the ancient Egyptians were using this mysterious substance, DMT. Now, it's quite a chemical operation to get the DMT out of the bark of the acacia. And therefore, it's worth remembering where we get the word chemistry from. Ancient Egyptians knew their land as Kemet. The Arabs called ancient Egypt Al-Kempt. And it's from that we get both the words alchemy and chemistry. So I believe the ancient Egyptians were working with DMT. At any rate, it's difficult to imagine a society more different from that than ours today. A society, I would say, our society today is waging a vicious war on consciousness. I was horrified to hear what happened to Jeremy, to be charged with a criminal offense in Belgium for talking about ayahuasca. This is taking the war on consciousness to new levels. Not only may we not experience certain kinds of consciousness, but we may be subject to criminal penalties even for speaking about those kinds of consciousness. This is a truly sinister situation that we live in. And 40 years plus of the war on drugs, 40 years of a continuous lie, of continuous propaganda from government sources have caused a great many people not even to think about this seriously anymore. It's become a central reference frame that drugs are just automatically a bad thing. And DMT is in fact a natural brain hormone. And there is more and more evidence that it is produced in the pineal gland. A recent study has made that pretty much certain. And yet it's a criminal offense to possess DMT, whether in its smokable form or as part of the ayahuasca brew. And you can have your door knocked down by the police, you can have all your property confiscated, you can have your reputation ruined, you can have your liberty taken away, simply for making the choice as an adult to explore your own consciousness with this natural substance. And I hazard to say that huge numbers, millions of people in our society completely support that policy and believe that it's right and proper for governments to patrol the consciousness of individuals. I think that we're dealing with a huge human rights issue here. There have been many human rights struggles that where goodness and clear thinking have prevailed, but this struggle is still being fought. Amanda Fielding at the Beckley Foundation is doing enormous work on the issue of cognitive liberty. If we as adults are not allowed to make sovereign decisions over our own consciousness while doing no harm to others, then I don't think there's any useful way in which we can say that we're free at all. It is the most fundamental of human rights, and it's a sign of the kind of society we live in if that society denies us as adults the right to make those choices. And it's clearly not an objection to altering consciousness as such, because our society is very happy for us to alter consciousness in certain prescribed ways. In fact, the large pharmaceutical companies make billions and billions of pounds and dollars from drugs that target and alter consciousness in certain ways. And there's a kind of unholy alliance between big pharma and general practitioners and psychiatrists, which every year is inventing new mental illnesses for which new pills are being prescribed, which all in one way or another alter consciousness, whether it's Ritalin for attention deficit disorder, whether it's the SSRIs like Prozac and Seroxat for supposedly for depression. All of these drugs, which are completely legal and which make billions of dollars for their manufacturers, are in the business of altering consciousness. Then there's our love affair with alcohol, which undoubtedly is extremely harmful to health. And which has profoundly negative social consequences. I personally would not seek to stop anybody drinking alcohol. I like a drink myself, as a matter of fact. But let's recognize that we don't fundamentally drink alcohol because of its taste. Alcohol is drunk because of its effects on consciousness. And it's the center of a multi-billion-dollar industry. And there are huge recognized harms with alcohol, but nobody is being sent to prison for drinking alcohol. Nobody is having their life ruined by the state or their doors broken down for drinking alcohol. On the contrary, large corporations are licensed to make huge amounts of money from the manufacture and glamorization of alcohol. And even tea and coffee and the energy drinks, these are also valued for their effects on consciousness. I think that what all of these kind of consciousness alterations have in common is that they don't, or they are not seen to threaten the fundamental state of consciousness that is valued by our society. And that's what I call the alert, problem-solving state of consciousness. That is the state of consciousness that our society wants us to be in most of the time. And in that state of consciousness, where we can be good producers and good consumers of material goods, we are allowed certain holidays from it. We are allowed to take a holiday with alcohol. That's seen as possibly beneficial in a way, allowing us to return to the alert, problem-solving state of consciousness. And if we get depressed because of the daily grind, well, then there's the Prozac and Seroxat to help us. And we're kind of told that this is the ideal state of consciousness for mankind. And I have no objection, in principle, to the alert, problem-solving state of consciousness. I would, for example, definitely when I get on an airplane, I would like the pilot to be in an alert, problem-solving state of consciousness. I would not like him to be in any other state of consciousness. I think the problem is that we have an over-monopolistic focus on this state of consciousness. We've raised it to a level where it doesn't belong, and we've said that it promises us everything. It promises us endless rewards. And I think that we're all realizing that that is not true. That yes, it's useful for Wall Street, it's useful for the prosecution of wars, it's useful for commerce, it's useful for industry. But the endless promises built upon it are proving hollow. The financial crisis has brought this home to everyone, that a society that is over-monopolistically focused upon the alert, problem-solving state of consciousness, pursuing short-term goals, fundamentally is going to implode. And that, yes, indeed, our bankers and our governments can go on magically printing electronic money for perhaps a few more decades, but sooner or later this system is broken and it doesn't work. It's a system that allows the grotesque abuse of wide-scale global pollution, of the proliferation of nuclear weapons. I mean, truly, you have to be insane as a society to invest in nuclear weapons. And to rationalize it and explain it as a rational thing to do is truly psychopathic behavior. And we can't even solve the problem of global hunger. And then there's the whole issue of the rape of the Amazon rainforest. Again, a society that was sane and balanced, a global technological society that was sane and balanced, would find a way to solve the problem of the destruction of the Amazon. It's clearly suicidal. The lungs of our planet, the greatest source of biodiversity on our planet, and we're mowing it down to plant soya bean farms so that we can feed cattle, so that we can all eat hamburgers. I mean, this is a very crazy idea. And only, I believe, an insane society could allow such a thing to happen. And I think it is the result of the over-monopolistic focus on the alert problem-solving state of consciousness and not allowing space for any other states of consciousness which might help us to see the Amazon as a sacred realm. So we are always capable of raising just countless billions of dollars for warfare. That's never a problem. Hatred, fear, and suspicion press our buttons, and we cough up the money to mobilize huge armies and invest in weapons of destruction and to create more division and hatred and fear and suspicion. But we are incapable of getting together as a global community to save the precious resource of the Amazon rainforest. And that's why I think the phenomenon of ayahuasca tourism is really interesting. And shamans I've spoken to in the Amazon and asked them to analyze the problem of the technological West, they say it's quite simple. You guys have severed your connection with spirit. If you don't reconnect with spirit, and if you don't do so soon, then you're going to bring the whole house of cards down on your heads and on ours. And in the midst of this crisis, we have this extraordinary phenomenon of ayahuasca finding its way out, a kind of reverse missionary activity as shamans from the Amazon travel all over the Western world, offering ayahuasca ceremony under the radar. And as Westerners make their way to the Amazon. And as Jeremy rightly said, this is the first time that Westerners have gone to the Amazon prepared to sit at the feet of the indigenous people and learn from them, rather than to go there with an arrogant, paternalistic, we have everything to teach you attitude. So I think that the ayahuasca phenomenon, although not without its dark side, Jeremy's right about that too. There is a dark side to ayahuasca. There is a dark side to all psychedelics. And that is partly to do with the choices that we make as we go along. I don't think it's an unmitigated blessing. But I think that it has a huge role to play in the transformation of global consciousness. Certainly there's a very insistent message in ayahuasca. It's one of those universals that almost everyone who drinks the brew sooner or later reports. And this is to do with the sacred, magical, enchanted, interconnected, infinitely precious nature of life on Earth and the interdependence of material and spiritual realms. Suddenly you get it. It's a really mysterious thing to be alive. It's a huge mystery. It's a tremendous mystery to be alive at all, to be born in a human body, to have this ability to make these fine discernments between right and wrong, between dark and light, between good and evil, to learn and to grow and to develop, to be born up and protected by this amazing, gorgeous garden of a planet in which we live. Ayahuasca takes that out of the realm of theory and brings it into the realm of direct, immediate experience in a very, very powerful way. And it's important to remember that ayahuasca is not alone, that it's a part of a global system of shamanism, which is by and large outside the control of the technocratic forces that dominate our culture, and which goes back very far in time. It's the work of Gordon Wasson and Albert Hoffman and Karl Ruck on the Eleusinian mysteries in Greece is extremely interesting. That it's almost certain that the kykeon drunk at Eleusis was a psychedelic potion. We have the DMT in the ancient Egyptian tree of life, a very strong argument that the soma of the Vedas was originally a brew based on the psychedelic Amanita muscaria mushroom. And then that whole issue of what happened to our ancestors 40,000 years ago, this sudden emergence into consciousness that appeared to have taken place. It's possible that that's when human languages first began, an enormous emergence into creativity and consciousness, as far as I'm concerned, definitely connected with experiences with psychedelics. And so I think that living in a society that will send us to prison for making use of these time-honored sacred plants to explore our own consciousness is a huge problem that absolutely needs to be addressed at the level of human rights. We do not have any human rights as an adult if we cannot make those choices over our own consciousness. We already have lots and lots of laws that deal with how we behave towards others. I have no problem if somebody on a psychedelic does harm to others. I think that person should be subject to the jurisdiction of the state. Doing harm to others is a fundamental wrong, and it should not happen. But exploring your own consciousness while doing no harm to others, that is absolutely not the business of the state. And we need a paradigm shift on this area. They can't say to us, no, you cannot explore that area of your consciousness because you might do harm to yourself or do harm to others. That is a step too far. There's a lot of very cloudy thinking on this, which needs to be sorted out. And we need to recognize that we are transgressing a fundamental human right here, and that we may be doing damage to ourselves as a species by demonizing and persecuting whole areas of consciousness. We could even be denying ourselves the next step in our own evolution, and who knows, there's no proof on this at all, but perhaps our immortal destiny as well. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
That was brilliant, guys. Thank you very much.
So we're running a little over time, and we have to get from that building, of course, by 8 o'clock. We've got to go to the film school, but we do have a few minutes for some questions for Ray, if anybody has one. Over here first.
I'm interested in the controversy around your talks, and as far as I remember, I read on the internet that you had challenged Richard Dawkins to take psychedelics to see whether that would affect his...
Yeah, I did.
I'm curious about the result of that, and that relates to the more general question: to what extent do you think that personal experience is valuable or even necessary to get accurate, supposedly objective scientific findings?
Well, yeah, a good question. Good question. I do think actually that personal experience is really important in this area, because the area of psychedelics deals fundamentally with personal experiences. I think that to view it entirely as there's a place for academic study without experience of psychedelics, but I personally think that academics who are working in this field are missing an important area of the inquiry if they don't take psychedelics themselves.
And what did Dawkins say?
Well, Dawkins is a very smart guy. I kind of ambushed him at a talk, and I asked him that question. And he said, well, yes, under properly controlled circumstances where he was assured that there would be no danger to his health, he would be willing to take psychedelics. But he's been pressed on that in a number of ways since then, and so far as I know, he hasn't done so. I think it would be a very interesting thing for him to do, and I hope that he would do so. And I think it would be interesting for him to have a series of ayahuasca sessions. I think that would be more useful than taking psilocybin in a lab. But who knows? Yeah. Yeah.
I recently read Penny Shannon's book. I want to ask you a question on themes, on snakes.
Yeah.
There's a very small section in there that's not really given so much notice, and that's the dropping of themes of snakes and felines after 150 doses.
Right.
Have you spoken to people about these thematic changes and why that's dropped?
Yeah, I haven't. I know Benny. I've read Benny's book thoroughly, and one of the things that it does is testify to the universal and transpersonal nature of ayahuasca experiences. It does seem from his reports and from my own experience that the themes do change. I think it's rightly said that ayahuasca is a school, you know, that it's a school from which lessons are being learned, and perhaps once you've learned one lesson, you move on to the next, and perhaps that's the reason that the themes change. After 50 sessions, I still do see serpents, and have a direct and immediate encounter with serpents, but not every session, not every time. Thank you.
There's a question at the back. Can you just shout it out?
You mentioned that DMT is naturally produced in the pineal gland.
Yes.
And I read all the time about fluorides calcifying the pineal
Yeah.
gland. And it's put in the water. Do you believe that it's put in the water purposely so we don't reach
Well,
the state of consciousness?
yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point. I have no idea what on earth they're playing at putting fluoride in the water. I mean, that is another example of our sovereignty over our bodies being taken out of our hands. You know? Sorry?
Hitler was one of the first people to put fluoride in water.
Why does that not surprise me? Yeah, exactly. I mean, again, this is a very sinister area. It's another way in which our governments just wantonly transgress our liberties as individuals and fail to recognize that we are individual sovereign adults. If I want fluoride in my water, well, let me add it myself, you know? Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know what the science is on the calcification of the pineal gland. I haven't looked into that.
But obviously it would stop the DMT production.
Well, yes, it would. Yes, and indeed, and the pineal gland is the third eye. So maybe maybe there is, you know, this is some sort of mass medication designed to prevent us from having visionary experiences. Thank God then for the plant allies, which overcome that problem. Yeah.
Just only time for one last question.
Okay. Yes.
Right?
I just wonder, given the nature of the way society and people in general use substances like alcohol, which are legal, do you really think that our society as it stands at the moment is ready to have free access to psychedelics?
Well, here's the ridiculous thing. I mean, the fact that we have a war on drugs and that psychedelics are illegal doesn't stop people taking or acquiring psychedelics. It just means that there's an element of jeopardy and danger in so doing, and that it's not possible to, or it's not easy to access psychedelics in a nurturing and positive and teaching way. I mean, I actually think that the removal of the war on drugs would immediately solve a huge range of drug-related problems, which we now have entirely because of the war on drugs. And it would be possible to create spaces where people could undergo completely safe and nurturing psychedelic experiences should they choose to do so. Of course, they wouldn't be compelled to do so. It would be their choice. Now, when one enters the psychedelic lottery, there's this fear in the background that one is going to be arrested, that society frowns upon it. It's very difficult to encounter a completely safe space in which to take psychedelics. So I think that every adult should have the right to make that choice, and I don't think it's so much a matter of our society not being ready for it. It's just that 40 years on the war on drugs has prevented us from setting up the right kind of nurturing environment in which psychedelics could be constructively, creatively taken in a healing and positive way, as fundamentally they are meant to be, and in a sacred way, should we choose to do so. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hancock.
Is this your...
Yeah.